Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the debates over imperialism, some pros and cons, and today we're going to talk about an example of imperialism, the Spanish American War. So, if you are ready, let's begin. All right, so some things to know, some ideas prior to the Spanish American War. Okay, first, we talked about this last time, but we need to understand Alfred T. Mahan's influence of sea power. We talked about how this was an important book that's written, and it encourages countries to build up their navies so that they can expand overseas. So America is thinking about this as they think about trying to expand. Cuba, also just so we kind of know the situation, Cuba is like very close to Florida, an American state, very close off the coast of Florida. And Cuba is currently a Spanish colony. And this goes against a lot of that idea from the Monroe Doctrine, which is that, right, Europe, you stay on your side, right? So it's the idea that America should be in charge of North and South America. And if Spain is over here with a colony in Cuba, that kind of goes against that idea of the Monroe Doctrine. And Cuba wants to get their independence from Spain. So that's kind of going on at the same time. Okay. And one of the reasons they want to is there's this guy named General Butcher Weiler, who is a Spanish general, and he's placing Cubans in camps. There's a lot of reports of atrocities that are going on. So this kind of gets a lot of Spanish people upset. Sorry, a lot of Cuban people upset. And it's also getting a lot of Americans to try to agree with the plight of the Cubans. And then the last kind of idea to know about that's going around all this time is something called yellow journalism. So this is a vocab term that we need to know. And basically, it means fake news or exaggerated news stories. So some famous journalists like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer at the time are writing news stories that are really exaggerating what's going on in Cuba and in Spain in terms of the relationship between Spain and Cuba. And they're trying to make it seem like the U.S. needs to take a role here. So yellow journalism is when the news kind of overreaches and exaggerates some news stories. Okay, so now that we have these ideas that we know prior to the war, let's break down the causes of the war. So there's two main causes. First of all, the first one's kind of a background cause. Okay, we got something called the Delome Letter, which was written in 1898, and this is a letter that the United States intercepts. It's written from a Spanish ambassador to to Spain, and the United States intercepts it. And basically, in this letter, the Spanish official is criticizing America's president at the time, who was William McKinley, and calling him weak. And when America reads this, it's again, we take offense to this letter. Okay. And then later on in 1898, in February, um, there is something called the USS Maine, which is a ship off the coast of Cuba, off the coast of Florida, and it explodes. Okay, it explodes in Havana Harbor, which is a harbor in Cuba. Okay, and there are 260 Americans on board, and Spain is blamed by the press of the United States for this situation. So we have all of a sudden 260 American lives have been lost, and Spain is getting blamed for it. Now, did Spain blow up this ship? Probably not, right? As they've learned about it afterwards, it was probably an accident, but the ship explodes. Spain's going to get blamed because the ship's in the Spanish port in Cuba, right? So people are going to be very upset with Spain. And so America is going to go to war with Spain over the colonies. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is actually not Cuba. We're going to talk about what's going on in the Philippines, which is all the way over in the Pacific Ocean. But the Philippines are also at this time a colony of Spain. And so Theodore Roosevelt, future president Theodore Roosevelt, at this time, he is the assistant secretary to the Navy. He is going to order U.S. ships to the Philippines because it's a Spanish colony. And so this mission is led by this guy pictured on the right with this wonderful mustache, George Dewey, and he defeats the Spanish at Manila Bay, okay, which is a bay in the Philippines. And so America now gains access to the Philippines. And it's really important to know that when America gains access to the Philippines, a lot of Filipino people become very nationalist. Okay. And they think that the Philippines should be granted independence. And America sort of promises their independence, but they don't ever give it to the Philippines. And this actually starts another war, which we're not going to talk much about, but it starts another war called the Philippine American War, all right, where the Philippine nationalists fight America to try to gain their independence through force. America wins this war against the Philippine nationalists. And so the Philippines stays a colony of the United States all the way through World War II. So about 40 years, the Philippines stays a colony of the United States. And again, this is a very controversial thing. We need to understand that. That's important to know that this is controversial because this, again, we're taking over a colony from Spain and we're not giving them their freedom. And this kind of goes against a lot of American ideals. If you think back to the anti-imperialist movement, all right? All right. So next is the Spanish-American War, and what's taking place in Cuba. All right. So the U.S. is also going to defeat the Spanish in Cuba, and that is thanks to Teddy Roosevelt himself and his group of soldiers called the Rough Riders. And they fight a very famous battle on San Juan Hill in Cuba. And when Teddy Roosevelt wins this battle, Roosevelt kind of becomes a war hero. He becomes a national sensation, and that's going to eventually vault Teddy Roosevelt to prominence and eventually to, he becomes the vice president and then he's going to become the president eventually as well. Okay. Now, just one thing to know that in this war, in a lot of wars, right, most of the deaths are caused by disease and not actually from the fighting itself. All right. So we've talked about how the U.S. has taken over the Philippines, which was Spanish, has taken over Cuba, which was Spanish. And so eventually we're going to sign a peace treaty. And this treaty is called the Treaty of Paris. Now, you got to be careful because if you're thinking back to the American Revolution, that peace treaty is also called the Treaty of Paris. But this is a different one. This is the one in the late 1800s that ends the Spanish-American War. So here's what comes out of this. First of all, America is going to let Cuba become independent. Okay. America is going to maintain a base in Cuba. That's called Guantanamo Bay, which eventually is going to come into the news for America is going to have like a prison in Guantanamo Bay. But Cuba is going to become independent and America is going to maintain a base in Cuba. The U.S. is also going to get some other Cuban land. Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory. The Philippines, which at the time, again, was a U.S. territory. And Guam. Okay. So the U.S. gains a lot of land of Spanish colonies. And in agreement with this, U.S. actually offers Spain $20 million to kind of tie up all this deal. And again, we got to know this is going to lead to debates between imperialists and anti-imperialists. Go back to last lesson. Think about why some people would think this is a good idea, why some people would think this is a bad idea. Okay, let's talk about the impacts of this war to wrap this up. So, first of all, the U.S. presence in Latin America is going to increase, right? So, Latin America is, south of the United States. And again, the U.S. is going to have more access to land there, like Cuba, like Puerto Rico. Okay. And so this kind of follows through with those ideas from the Monroe Doctrine. Another impact of the war is a series of cases, court cases called the Insular cases. And what Puerto Ricans argue when Puerto Rico becomes a territory of the United States is that does the Constitution apply to these territories? Are people in Puerto Rico, are Puerto Ricans now citizens of the United States? Do they have all the exact same rights as citizens from, say, Connecticut? Okay. And the Supreme Court decides that no, people in territories do not have the same rights as people in the mainland United States. Okay. You have to be an official state to gain equal access to all rights. For example, one of those rights would be voting for president, right? Today, Puerto Rico, still a territory, does not have any electoral college votes in the vote for president. Okay. They don't have representation in Congress. They have a representative they send, but they can't vote. All right. All right. And then the last important impact of this war is this thing called the Platt Amendment, which is another important treaty to know about. And basically what this says is that Cuba is not allowed to sign a treaty with any other country that would jeopardize its independence. So Cuba has to remain independent. And America does that because America does not want Cuba to kind of be taken over by another European power. It says that the U.S. is allowed to intervene in Cuban affairs, and it gives the U.S., like we talked about before, Guantanamo Bay, which becomes a military prison in Cuba. Okay, so it basically maintains a foothold in Cuba for the United States so that the United States can still have a presence in Latin America. All right, so that is it for the Spanish-American War. Thank you so much for watching. Let's go over our big ideas. Number one, let's talk about the causes of the Spanish-American War and make sure we are being specific. And then number two, let's talk about the effects of the Spanish-American War. Be as specific as you can. So that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.